And we are live. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning if you are anywhere where it's morning at the moment. And thank you all so much for joining tonight's event. The title of which is "From Creed to Conquest: The Political Reality of Islam." Yesterday was the 10th year anniversary of the Bataclan massacre, where I believe roughly 130 people were slaughtered through an Islamist attack in Paris. Just since 9/11, we've had the Bali bombings where 202 people were killed. We had the Madrid train bombings where 193 people were killed. We had the Beslan siege, Beslan school siege, where over 330 people, mostly children, were murdered. There was the London bombings, the Mumbai attacks, the Fort Hood shooting, the Westgate Mall attack, the Charlie Hebdo attack, the Peshawar school massacre, the San Bernardino attacks, the Brussels bombings, the Orlando Night School shooting, the Nice truck attack, the Berlin Christmas market attack, the Westminster attack, the Manchester Arena bombing, the London Bridge attack, the Barcelona Ramblas attack, the Sri Lanka Easter bombings, and of course, the brutal gang rapes on an industrial scale of mostly British working class girls that has been going on since at least 1997, where some people estimate the number of victims to be in the hundreds of thousands. More conservative estimates put that around tens of thousands, but we are talking about numerous, in fact, incalculable numbers of victims of girls, some as young as 10 or 11, which is what brings us to tonight's event, because we are reminded that questions of Islam and the West are not abstract but immediate. They are lived and they are contested. So this interview will examine how we got here and what pathways remain open for meaningful dialogue and perhaps someday peaceful coexistence. Our guest today is Omid Pos, who is a voice who's becoming increasingly important in Sweden's public conversations about Islam, faith, and the clash of values between East and West, although perhaps that should be rephrased as Middle East and West. Omid is the author of the book Islam and Christian Faith, as well as the report Islamic Values and Western Values. He has participated in multiple public debates with Muslim representatives and has appeared in various media channels in Sweden, where he brings a theological clarity and first-hand insight into one of the most, or in my opinion, the most pressing question of our time, which is how does Islam shape the human mind, identity, and society in a profound way? Now, that is very much the framing of our conversation today, because Umi's perspective is unique. He was once himself an active member of a mosque in Sweden, but 16 years ago, he converted to Christianity. And this personal journey gave him a very rare vantage point where he's been involved in both sides of the divide and inside both worldviews. And today he uses that experience to help Western audiences to not only understand, but also, I suppose, capture the theological differences between Islam and Christianity, but also the psychological, the cultural, and the moral implications that follow from them. Omid, thank you so much for joining us. Did I leave anything out from your bio that you want to raise before we kick off with the questions?
No, that was satisfactory. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much. So, as I mentioned earlier in my introduction, I want to frame this conversation in a way that hasn't really been framed before, and very often what we see when we listen to both proponents of Islam as well as critics of Islam getting bogged down in individual verses from the Hadith or the Quran or the Sunnah, and they go back and forth and they say, well, this verse from the sword verses say this, but this says that, and it gets kind of bogged down. However, what people often miss, and this is something that you've in your research really highlighted, is that this verse hunting approach is a bit of a not just a misnomer, but also a red herring. That the real issue isn't just a few problematic texts, but something much deeper. So, could you start off by explaining why you believe that it's not about isolated verses, and what are people missing when they focus on what's the word? Sword verse. And in your view, what lies at the true root of this tension between Islam and the West?
Well, thank you. And that's a great place to start because Islam, like most religions, it's not a collection of problematic verses. I mean, Islam is a comprehensive worldview and a religion. And every religion is meant to answer three basic questions. Who is God? Who are we? And how should we live together? And in Islam, all three resolves around the idea of submission to divine will. I mean, the word Islam itself means submission. So when a Muslim bows his head or her head 5 times a day, placing his forehead on the ground, that repeated act forms the human mind. It creates a certain kind of a person, someone who is now trained to see human purpose and social relationships and being about submission to divine command. So such a mind naturally opposes Western ideal of independence, freedom, democracy. So the tension between Islam and the West doesn't come from, as you said, isolated verses. It comes from two competing worldviews. Islam and absolute submission, West and individual freedom, personal autonomy, and democratic values. And until we recognize that we are dealing with opposite mindset, two ways of wanting the world to be that are actually in enmity with each other, we'll be having the conversation in the wrong way.
Exactly. So what you're really saying that is that the ontological reality that Islam creates within its adherents, but also in the societies where it is prominent, creates a mentality and a psyche that is not just vastly different than the Western mentality or the democratic mentality, but it's actually in odds with it. There is an inevitable clash there. And let's dig into that. So we look at immigration from different cultures and faiths, and each bring their own challenges. In your research, however, you suggest that Islam stands apart, that there are structural elements within the religion that makes integration into Western society uniquely difficult. So could you explain what those elements are, and I suppose what is it within Islam's worldview and not just the texts that creates this deeper tension between Islamic identity and Western values?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think the foundational difference is this, that in Islam, divine truth and public law are one and the same thing. I mean, Islam is not designed to be a private, personal spirituality. This Islam is built to govern society. So for a devout Muslim, God has not just spoken about how your heart is supposed to be. God has spoken about how families and nations and society, how it has to function. And the believer is commanded to judge every single matter in all these areas according to what Allah has revealed. So, for example, in Surah chapter 5 of the Quran, 3 times it is repeated that whoever does not judge by what Allah has revealed is a disbeliever, is rebellious, is on his way to hell. So in other words, there is no middle ground in Islam. So the Muslim mind can never embrace the Western system, because the Western system is human-made, it's secular, it is not built on the divine law. And so it is, in the Muslim mind, the Western system is inherently illegitimate. And this is not how other religions function. Most religions allow you to separate belief from politics or society or national identity. But Islam does not allow that split, because in Islam, creed, law, and community are fused into one single thing.
Yeah, so that's the audience who may be familiar with some of my writings are probably sick of me saying that exact principle multiple times in multiple articles, where I repeatedly first question the notion of what a religion even is. Imagine if I were to start a movement where I believe that all people with ginger hair should be murdered. Immediately we consider that an evil belief. However, the moment I label it as a religion, I will somehow get a pass. And I think that's the problem here, that Islam operates under this rubric of religion without it actually being examined of what that entails and how that differs from other religions. And you've described this clash of between Islamic divine systems and a secular national one. But how does this clash of authorities impact individual Muslims?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that the more seriously a Muslim seeks the fullness of Islam, the more Western society feels immoral. Because in the West, society says that, well, law comes from humans. Authority is something negotiable. Individuals, they choose their own path in life. But in Islam, it teaches fundamentally the exact opposite. So, for example, in Surah 25, verse 43 of the Quran, it says that anyone who follows his own desires is taking his desires as his God. Now, this is important because in Islam, having another God besides Allah is the worst possible sin you can commit. It is shirk. So think about it. Personal autonomy and freedom, the very core of Western values, it's seen as disloyalty to Allah. It is seen as shirk. It is seen as the greatest possible sin. It is the way to hell. And this is the reason why in classical Islam, the world is divided into Dar al-Islam, the house of Islam, where God rules, and Dar al-Harb, the house of war, where humans rule. And the dividing line is authority. That's what's important. So integration is not mainly a cultural or economic challenge here. It's about loyalty and legitimacy. The devout Muslim experiences that they are in a society that their scripture tells them is ultimately abhorrent in God's eyes and would lead to idolatry, the worst possible sin. And so obviously the result is predictable. I mean, distance, distrust, and sometimes hostility towards Western values. The West can never truly be your home, because if you devout yourself, fully embrace Islam, the West becomes a temporal, moral, corrupt place, one that you ought to oppose and even in certain cases sacrifice for the sake of the religion of Islam. So what I'm trying to say is that the more devout a Muslim becomes, the stronger the resistance towards the West and Western values.
Yeah, I think going back to what is missing in the discourse in most media outlets is precisely this non-understanding of that concept. As the viewers may be able to see, I wear a necklace of Israel around my neck, even though I'm not Jewish, I'm not Israeli. But I do it because I see Israel as very much that Western element in a area dominated by this mindset or these convictions. And put a layer on top of that. So they would have been hated even if they weren't Jewish, being in that environment and thriving in that environment. But put a layer on top of that, that the fact that they are Jewish, which is arguably an even worse sin than just being Westerner. And then you'd understand that it has nothing to do with geographical territory or real estate. It has to do with precisely what you're mentioning, that it is an affront on the entire foundation of Islamic faith, that such an entity exists within their midst, in the Dar al-Harb, or sorry, Dar al-Islam, in the House of Islam, in that territory, that an affront to Islam really exists. And of course, the matter is worsened by the fact that Israel not only exists, but is thriving, whereas most Islamic countries, to quote the orange man from America, are shithole countries. You start to get a sense of why they are so hated. They are hated because they are successful. They are hated because they are, well, let's say civilized, for lack of a better word. Now, I think this intense and often violent reactions to things like, we've seen it in Sweden, we've seen it in the UK, where people might burn a Quran or insult Muhammad, conflicts affecting the Ummah, basically. To a Westerner raised in the cultures that we are raised in, where we have individual conscience and freedom of speech, this can seem baffling. How can anyone be so viscerally affected by a cartoon? Your research, however, suggests that this isn't just anger, this isn't just offense, but it stems from a completely different psychological framework. And I want to know what you mean by that. Could you elaborate a little bit on the inner world of a Muslim believer and how Islamic theology shapes the sense of identity and loyalty and belonging?
That's an amazing question, and but what makes it sometimes very difficult is that Westerners often underestimate how deeply worship of God shapes the human mind. Now think about it. What is worship? Worship, the word means worth-ship. It's ascribing worth to something. Worship is saying, this thing is the highest good. This is what I will adore. This is what I will organize my entire life around. And whatever you worship, whatever you give your deepest worth to, that begins to shape your identity, your desires, and your sense of right and wrong. Now, think about it for a moment. Consider the fact that the devout Muslim from childhood, 5 times a day, he bows his head, literally his forehead, on the ground before Allah. That repeated act forms the mind to adore what Allah is. So who is Allah? What is Allah like? Because worship determines what kind of a person you become. Now, if you ask a Christian who is God, A Christian might say God is love, and they start talking about the fact that God exists as Father, Son, Holy Spirit, a community of love, and that God entered the world because of love and suffered and died out of love for humanity. So a Christian naturally begins to value love because the God that the Christian worship is characterized by love. But in Islam, Allah is Allah isn't persons in loving communion. Allah does not enter the world. He doesn't die for anyone out of love. And the Quran makes it very clear, repeated amount of times, that Allah does not love everyone. Allah does not love disbelievers. Allah's love is conditional and selective. You can read that in Surah 3, verse 32, Surah 3, verse 57, Surah 30, verse 45, Surah 2, 1, verse 119. It's all over the place. So because of that, love can't be the defining center of Allah's identity. And in order to understand how Allah impacts the Muslim mind and the Muslim way of seeing things and thinking, we have to start with the question, then who is Allah? What defines Allah, which the Muslims worship so much 5 times a day? What defines Allah more than anything? And I can ask you that, actually, because you come from a Muslim country. When you think about Allah, what attributes or what characteristics come to your mind, Amir?
I suppose for me, it's very much about power. It's all
Mm.
powerful. And I don't
Mm.
just mean that from an omnipotent perspective that he can create everything, but I also mean power as in the tyrannical form. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I don't mean that in a negative way, but as someone who is so powerful that he has dominion over everything and
Mm.
all. I suppose
Mm.
that would be the impression that I would have of Allah.
And exactly, Amir. I mean, that's true. It actually corresponds to Islamic scriptures and so on. Allah is defined above all things about. It's defined by absolute power, sovereignty, unquestioned authority. So think about it. 5 times a day, the Muslim adores all powerful master. I mean, every Muslim begins his prayer, the 5 prayers, with reciting Surah Al-Fatiha, which says, Maliki al-Madin, the master of the day of judgment, the master, the master, the master. And this repeated act of worshiping this master, this all-powerful master, it's not just devotion, it is psychological formation. Think about what is becoming internalized in the Muslim day after day. Power, authority, hierarchy, that reflects the highest good because that reflects Allah. That's why strong husbands, strong imams, strong rulers, and rigid societal roles are normal in the Muslim world. They mirror the character of Allah, who is the ultimate good. And just as importantly, the opposite of Allah's character becomes the opposite of goodness, namely evil. So Western values like personal freedom or women choosing their lifestyle or flexible social roles or questioning authority, it doesn't just feel wrong, it feels morally abhorrent. If you recall, I said earlier in Surah 25, verse 43, anyone who follows their own desires has taken those desires as a god. And in Islam, that is shirk, that is the greatest sin. But what is Western democracy? It's built on the belief that people should follow their own judgment, choose their own path, and define their own lives. From a devout Muslim perspective, this is systemized idolatry. This is an entire civilization based on shirk, the worst possible sin. That makes the Western world an enmity to the God Muslims worship. Muslims pray 5 times a day to this all-powerful master that creates a mind that says submission to authority is the greatest good. And here in the Western democracy, they're supposed to embrace that and like that. That's not possible.
I think I almost want to go one step further. In that you've been mentioning the Muslims who pray 5 times a day. I remember being in Iran. I was never a Muslim I never believed in Islam. I never recall a moment where I believed in Allah. But and I was just a child. I left Iran when I was 8 years old, but that mentality was still ingrained in me. That I was already conditioned in that mentality, even though I wasn't a believer or even knew about the any of the beliefs of Islam. But because it's almost like a fog entering over a land, and whether you believe in the fog or not, you can't help but become that it becomes part of you and part of your surrounding and your environment. So even, I mean, we look at you live in Sweden where I grew up, and Sweden has had, obviously, since 2015, an enormous influx of immigrants from Islamic countries. And I would dare to say that a significant number of them aren't what you would call a textbook devout Muslim who prays 5 times a day, who reads the Quran, etc., etc. So they might not even believe in it, but they have all those values that you mentioned. All of it is all about power, and the idea of individual conscience is not just not just foreign, but like you say, it's to be looked down on. um I know we go on for a bit longer, and then we'll open up for Q&A with the audience, but I want to kind of delve into the structure of Islamic worship, forming this mindset that admires power and hierarchy and unquestionable obedience. Whereas, obviously, in the West, we look at John Stuart Mill and we look at David Hume, and going back to Socrates and Aristotle, we're a society that celebrates and pursue individual rights and a shared authority and personal freedom. So the Western moral vision is almost, I suppose, a mirror opposite of the Islamic ideal. And I suppose it makes sense then that the devout Muslim don't naturally value Western principles the way we might hope. So instead, they esteem the reverse, submission under absolute authority, which they see as the true divine order. So when a Muslim takes Islam seriously, it becomes very difficult to feel at home in a Western built system that is lying on a completely different and antithetical foundations.
Yeah, exactly. And this doesn't occur consciously. I mean, most Muslims don't probably. I don't know about most Muslims, but I believe that many Muslims are not conscious about the psychological formation that worship does have. And I can also say this is not all, of course. We need to also talk about one of the most dominant psychological forces in the Muslim mindset as well, which is connected to this, namely honor and shame. Because you see, in the Muslim framework, honor and shame, they're not cultural preferences. They are sacred theological realities. And this is so important to understand, but in all honesty, to a Western audience, it is so difficult to explain. You see, Islamic scripture often portrays honor as something very valuable. For example, in Surah 62, verse 8 of the Quran, it says that all true honor belongs to Allah, his messengers, and the believers. And such statements, they fuse divine honor, communal honor, and personal honor into one reality. So a Muslim's entire sense of worth, spiritual, social, or moral, becomes tied to upholding honor and avoiding shame. But what is honor and shame? Listen carefully. Honor is order. Honor is the public demonstration that things are in their right place within God's divine order. Shame, then, is disorder. It is the public proof that you have stepped outside that order. For example, in Surah 33, verse 59 of the Quran, it instructs women to cover themselves so that they may be recognized as decent Muslim women and not be harassed. Now that's not merely modesty. It's a public uniform of honor. A covered woman is in order, therefore she's honorable. An uncovered woman steps outside of divine structure, hence she's shameful. And because honor is something collective in the Muslim mindset, it's not individual. Because it's collective, a man's honor depends on the behavior of the women under his care. If the woman obeys, the man is honored. If she disobeys, the man is shamed. Therefore, the man must control his women. This is why, in devout Muslim contexts, female autonomy is a direct threat to the families and the ummahs, the Muslims' honor. So there is therefore a great drive to want to control women's behavior. She's not just an individual. She's a vessel of the entire families and the ummah's public honor. But notice what happens in the West. Western norms: women uncovered, autonomous, expressive, self-determined. I mean, they are the very embodiment of shame. And did you notice that in Surah 35, verse 59 of the Quran, it says that the reason why women should cover themselves is also so that they do not get harmed or harassed. In other words, what this causes is a mindset in which an uncovered woman, if she's mistreated, she shares the guilt because she stepped outside the honor framework that protects her dignity. She's viewed as unworthy of respect because she's already a symbol of shame. She can actually be mistreated without the person mistreating her feeling so much guilt because she is the embodiment of shame.
Yeah, I think, very much this idea, and the title of this talk is very much from creed to conquest. And there is a perfect example of conquest resulting from creed, because conquest is not just territorial. It's Islamic men having conquest over their women. And that is something that, as an Iranian, I inherently understand, that this idea of a woman as a possession and as a, like you say, a vessel for my honor, and that any deviation from what I believe Allah demands the woman to be is a dishonor, is something that I cannot live with, and therefore I need to act. And that results into the many honor killings that we've heard. So whenever I've seen honor killings being discussed in Western media, I always feel that they don't get it. They think this is just I suppose a misogynist dad who happens to be, and we used to have misogynists in the West because women didn't have the vote, as if there's any equivalence between. They're not even the same disease. They're not the same category there. And I think the way you frame it, if we go back one step and look at it holistically, is a head-on collision. Because what you've described is this honor order framework, which is rooted in scripture, which cannot be challenged, which cannot be changed. And that creates a deeply problematic view of Western women, as you mentioned, regarding them as shameful. Curious, how far does this mindset go? That it doesn't stop there. It's a totaling mindset. And how does that logic apply to other Western core values like secularism, or the concept of freedom of speech or freedom of choice?
That's a very good question, because you're absolutely right. This is not just about women. Honor and shame is, as you mentioned, a totalizing mindset that evaluates everything. Once honor is defined as living within God's order, then anything outside that order is not it's not just simply different, it's shameful.
Mm.
So Western freedom, and not just gender roles and public immodesty, but even males and females mixing in schools, or sexual autonomy, or freedom of speech, all of it triggers the same kinds of reaction: disgust. The foundational values of the West are actually shameful. So let's take what you mentioned with free speech. So Surah 33, verse 57 of the Quran says that those who insult Allah and His Messenger are cursed and disgraced. So mocking Muhammad, for example, is not just an expression, it is a direct attack on the sacred order. It's a public act of shaming God, the Prophet, and the entire Muslim community. And in an honor shame system, public shame, and this is so important to get, but it's so difficult for a Western to understand. Public shame is an existential threat.
Yes.
Someone must respond, often with violence, to purge the shame and restore honor, to show that the Muslim community, the Ummah, is worthy of honor and will not tolerate shame. Therefore, around the world, riots occur to restore honor. You will also make sure to protect other Muslims from the shameful mindset of the West by teaching them to despise the West, protect your family from it, creating distance from the West, building parallel societies, rebuilding honor through Islamic norms, and also longing for divine order. So this is why integration isn't just difficult for devout Muslims. For many, it is psychologically repugnant and theologically unacceptable to embrace the shameful West with its because West is so much outside of the divine order. It is disgusting at its root.
It's I love that you use the word disgust. I don't know if you've read Aurel Colnai's book on disgust. That's the name of the book. Was
No.
maybe published 25 years ago or so, and in it, it's been a while since I read it, but in it he makes it was considered a huge breakthrough, because disgust, the way he, and I will probably misremember quite a lot, but the phenomenology of disgust and aversion that he presented is very much rooted in life and death. That's where it comes from. And ironically and interestingly, if I remember correctly, the flip side of disgust is actually arousal, which is very interesting, because they are the two sides of the same coin there. And if you really take into account the impact of disgust in a human psyche, and look at it purely as much as possible, and if Kulnai was right, and I believe he was, that it is a matter of life and death for that person, that is a moral thing. Even when you smell something and you're disgusted by it, you're not actually disgusted by its smell, but it's a moral element that happens in your psyche that rises. So if Kolnai is right, and the Muslim is disgusted by the sight of a woman who's not covered head to toe, it actually evokes much more severe emotions within him that is not necessarily satisfied by just using the word, well, it's wrong, because it's a matter of life and death. And I think I might have chuckled a bit when you said how critical it is for the public humiliation, how life and death, what a matter of life and death that is. Because growing up, and when my mother was a Muslim, having guests over, there couldn't be a single dust, speck of dust, because not because you want to look good or anything, but because having a speck of dust is eternal shame, is disgust. What would they think? What would they say? What will others say about us, that we are poor, etc., etc.? So I know at an emotional level everything that you say. So this isn't just an intellectual exercise you're presenting, but it's actually a truism at a much deeper level. So sorry, it was a bit of a tangent there, but let's summarize briefly. We've discussed how worship in Islam forms a mindset that reveres absolute authority and submission, which naturally clashes with Western ideas of autonomy and equality. And on top of that, Islamic honor shame dichotomy or theology creates a framework where Western society isn't just seen as different, but as inferior and shameful, and something which a devout Muslim must instinctively reject or even fight against. So we've had these two pillars creating an enormous tension already. But I have a feeling that you have more in your Christmas sack, where there might be another dimension that contributes to this sense of not just distance, but hostility between Muslims and the West, something that goes beyond worship and honor shame that shapes how Muslims see themselves in the world.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And that dimension is the Ummah, the global Muslim community. So, as you said, if worship shapes the mind and honor and shame shapes moral perception, the Ummah shapes identity and loyalty. You see, the Quran, it describes the Muslims as one single unified body, which is called the best of all people in Surah 3, verse 110 of the Quran. So devout Muslim, when the devout Muslim sees other Muslims, he is ought to think, these are my people, this is my nation, this is my true family. And this loyalty has actually an official name. It's al-wala wa al-bara, al-wala wa al-bara, loyalty and disawal. It means it commands complete loyalty to Allah, Muhammad, and the believers, complete separation on hostility towards unbelievers and their system. And this comes from the Quran. The Quran makes this absolutely clear. Surah 5, verse 51 of the Quran, do not take Jews and Christians as allies. Surah 58, verse 22 of the Quran, Muslims shouldn't love those who oppose Allah. Surah 48, verse 29 of the Quran, those who are with Muhammad are forceful against disbelievers, but merciful amongst themselves. And probably the strongest statement of them all comes from Surah 60, verse 4 of the Quran, where Abraham is brought up as a pattern of conduct, where Abraham tells tells disbelievers that there is animosity and hatred forever against us, between us. I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Now these verses do not merely define belief; they define who your people are and who they are not. So put this identity inside a Western democracy, and the conflict is obvious. You're asking a devout Muslim to transfer loyalty from the Ummah to a secular nation, to embrace a system rooted in values that reject Islam. You're asking the Muslim to feel solidarity with the people that the Quran explicitly says you should not love, and Allah himself doesn't love them, and integrate into a society that the Quran calls disorder and shameful. It's not just difficult, it's betrayal. It is betrayal of the identity you have, the community you have, and the God you have. So simply put, the ummah creates loyalty structure where you feel like the West can never be truly your home, because your true home, the true nation, that's the Muslim community.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the time you applying this to the real world, you say, why do they go after Israel so much? And I'm sorry to bring it back to that, but I think it's relevant to drive home the point you just made, because you'd ask a devout Muslim, why are you so focused obsessively on Israel, where when in Yemen 400,000 people were killed over a much shorter period than the entire existence of Israel. In Syria, 600,000 were killed, etc., etc. And that was Muslim on Muslim violence. And that has never an impact on the person you're speaking to, because in their mind, it's an internal inter-Ummah, shall we say, phenomenology that is happening there. And it doesn't really register as critical. Whereas when there are Jews or people outside of the Ummah, and I suppose from a theological perspective as well as historical perspective, the Jews are considered as far away from the Ummah as you can possibly get,
Mm.
then that is an affront, again, going back to it. So within that framework, within that psyche, it makes sense that the Muslims don't care about their Islamic brethren in Yemen or in Syria, but they care so much in Gaza and in the West Bank. And I think this doctrine that you're painting for us, enmity and hatred forever, you've defined the Ummah as I suppose, a master identity built on a theological rules that command separation and disavowal. So what happens when you put that mindset, that vehicle inside Western democracy? And how does that horizontal global loyalty you described actually play out against the vertical national loyalty that the UK, Sweden, the US, etc., expects from its citizens?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this mindset reshapes everything: identity, emotion, loyalty. So, devout Muslim in Malmö in Sweden may feel more kinship with Gaza than with Swedes, because the Ummah is the true family. And this is why a cartoon in Copenhagen shakes the entire Muslim world, or a conflict in Palestine ignites riots across Europe, or a statement about Mohammed in France causes such violent protests in Pakistan. I mean, these are reactions that show that for Muslims, the Muslims are Ummah members first and foremost. By the way, this pattern actually comes from Muhammad directly. I mean, Muhammad, he drafted himself when he came to the city of Medina, what is called the Medina Constitution. And if you ever read the Medina Constitution, which you find for free online, you see that Muhammad wrote that Muslims are supposed to segregate themselves. They're supposed to have distinct laws, distinct loyalty, and distinct identity from others. So it was actually the first parallel society in Islam. And that blueprint repeats itself today in Europe. You have parallel schools, parallel charities, parallel councils, parallel neighborhoods, and the idea that assimilation equals betrayal of the Ummah. You see, you don't join your opponent's house. You strengthen your own house. And whenever there's a conflict, because you mentioned a lot of conflicts, wherever there's a conflict like Muhammad being mocked, or Muslims being harmed by non-Muslims, or what is going now on in Palestine, Ummah loyalty immediately overrides any civic loyalty. It's automatic, it's theological. Because for many devout Muslims, the West will never be home, because their home already exists. It's the Ummah, the one nation under Allah. And whenever there's any conflict between the West and the Ummah, the West must be sacrificed. The West is the enemy. The West must be fought. And so I think you put it in a very, very good way, where you have conflicts between Muslims. Well, that's within the Ummah. That's a totally different thing compared to having conflicts between the West and the Ummah, which is actually extremely normal. Then the West must be sacrificed for the sake of the Ummah.
Yeah. I know that your area of expertise is very much philosophy or theology, but can I get you to pontificate a little bit on, if I were to say to you, hey, Omid, you're saying all of this, but Muslims have been living in the UK, where I reside, for 100 years at least. And in Sweden, we've had Muslims living since at least the 1960s or 70s. And that's been going fine. So, what are you on about? What are you talking about? How would you? I mean, I know my answer, but I'm curious to hear yours.
Yeah, so Muslims are not a monolithic group. There's difference between Muslims and Muslims. Some Muslims, like for example, coming from Bosnia, they're very secular. They hardly know anything about Islam. They hardly ever read the Quran and so on. They just call themselves Muslims and don't know anything about it. What I'm talking about is when Muslims actually dig deep into their own religion and allow their religion to form their mindset and create the worldview. That's when we get the trouble. And I will say that perhaps you could say that the majority of Muslims don't know their religion very well, but they become the grass that sort of hides the snakes. Does that make sense?
It
Uh,
makes
where
perfect sense.
where you
Great
have
analysis.
definitely you have Muslims who know the religion very well, and when you dig deep into Islam, you can't avoid the massive xenophobia that Islam creates in the mindset. I mean, the Quran and the Sunnah, they call disbelievers for the kafir. I don't know if you know what the word kafir means, because in the minds of some people, oh, the word kafir, it's a term for people who don't believe. But that's not true. The word kafir, yes, it is that term for people who don't believe, but the word itself, it means one who covers, one who conceals the truth. This means that for a Muslim, disbelief isn't just an innocent mistake. It's a moral act of rebellion. It's evil. They're evil just because they don't believe in obviously Islam. And the way the Quran speaks about these disbelievers is with such intensity. Like Surah 8, verse 55, the disbelievers are the worst of all creatures. Surah 98, verse 6 repeats that the disbelievers are the worst of all creatures. This is not language of difference. It's the language of degradation. In the Quran, the kafir, the disbelievers, are deaf, dumb, and blind. That's Surah 2, verse 171. They're like cattle in Surah 7, verse 179. And Surah 47, verse 8 and 9 says that kafir, they hate what Allah has revealed. That means their disbelief is not ignorance, it's hostility against Allah. In Surah 9, verse 28, they're called impure, unclean. These descriptions are all over the place in the Muslim literature, and they form a mindset. They are psychologically conditioning, linking non-Muslims to impurity, condemnation, danger. So there is within the Quran and the Islamic scriptures, there is no space for there being a neutral other. Such a place does not exist. Rather, what the Islamic scriptures cause is that the mindset that humanity is split. You have the pure and the impure, the guided and the deviant, the submissive and the rebellious. And once that contrast becomes internalized, it shapes everything in the Muslim mindset. How Muslims perceive the Western people, the Western society, and how they start viewing that as a category of kafir, as something shameful, impure, evil, horrible. And obviously, that internalization doesn't happen like that overnight. It's a slow process where you have Muslims at this end, they haven't even been impacted maybe by it, and you have Muslims at this end who are so hostile that they are just hoping that one day the Western world would fall and be under Islamic rule. And you have everything in between. But here's the important thing. Once you have these people who take Islam very seriously, they will impact other Muslims and make other Muslims turn towards taking Islam much more seriously. And you get much more hostility against the Western world, much more segregation, and a lot of more conflicts.
Yeah, that's I couldn't agree more. I think there is a pattern where we see a critical mass being reached, and once that critical mass is reached within a society, then there is no turning back. I know we have 3 minutes left where before we open up for Q&A, and I had tons of other questions I wanted to ask you. Perhaps we can ask the audience if they want to join now, or they're okay with me asking a few more questions. I'm more than happy. In fact, I would insist on audience participation as well. If you could write in the chat or do a part two. I'd be more than delighted to if Omid would oblige to have a part two. But we still have half an hour left. So for now, please, if you have questions, I don't know if there is a hand raising function here. So just write something in the chat. I can see all participants on my screen. I understand that you can't see each other, but what I do is that I invite you to the stage and you can ask a question to Omid or to even to myself. So feel free to just put in the chat, I have a question, or just put the letter Q. So whilst we wait, if someone has a question, let me ask you something else. So we've discussed this. Well, from this conversation over the last hour, a very stark image has started to emerge where a psychological engine built from worship of a divine order and an honor shame framework that instinctively rejects Western values. And then on top of that, or if you wish, the engine of that is the Ummah, which demands total loyalty, especially in scenarios where there is a conflict between the Ummah and Dar al Halb. Uh, this creates not just a cultural distance, but a whole different moral universe, and one that obviously Muslims naturally pull away from Western integration and often make them hostile to it, which I suppose brings us to the next inevitable point, which is if the Ummah is the in group demanding total loyalty and protection, how do then Islamic theology or scriptures uh, instruct believers to view the out group?
Mm. Yeah, so as I earlier said, I mean, the in the within the Islamic scriptures, the outgroup, the unbelievers, is the worst of creatures. They're like cattle. They rebel against revelation. Therefore, friendship becomes towards them for Muslims becomes disloyalty, because these verses that I've mentioned, they don't merely describe the kafir. They define the relationship a believer must have with the kafir. And in worst case, the Quran carries this into the political realm. I mean, in Surah 9, verse 29 of the Quran, it commands Muslims to fight those who do not believe in Allah until they pay the jizya and feel themselves subdued. And these kinds of teaching, it causes a mindset where Muslims are to view the kafir not as equal partners in shaping society, but ultimately in the ideal world, a Muslim must desire a world where the kafir is converted or fought or ruled over. So the end goal is never coexistence, absolutely not. It's rather submission. So a Muslim can live among non-believers, but never feel for them when the Muslim obviously takes Islam very seriously, because the categories are already set. The believer is light, the disbeliever is darkness. And because the West is a world of kafirs, it could be a place to live in, perhaps, but never a place you can feel solidarity with. Rather, it's a place that the more you embrace Islam fully, it's a place of hostility towards that place.
Yeah, a master servant or master slave, subjugation of non-Muslims. And I suppose there are tiers to that. So the people of the book are at one tier, still significantly below the Muslims, but above their polytheists, and certainly above someone like myself, an atheist, who I suppose there is no jizya for me to pay because I'm doomed to death. And then there is the worst of the worst, which is the apostate. Would that be a correct categorization?
I guess the worst, absolute worst state you could be in is to be an apostate, and the reason is because then you have not just denounced belief, you have actually shamed the ummah, and shame is the worst possible thing. So Muhammad was absolutely clear, and all Muslim scholars in the area are absolutely clear that the punishment for apostasy must be death due to that reason. And that just shows how much honor and shame is embedded in the Muslim mind, that you have to actually kill, even if it's your relative or your family member, for the sake of restoring honor to the religion. I guess there's a question there.
Yeah, I was just gonna go. So I can read out the question, or David, if you want to, I can unmute you and bring you to stage. I'll wait for you to confirm. Maybe you don't want to be on stage, but just say yes, and I'll put you on stage, or say no, and I'll just read out your question. You can read it out loud. Okay, so in your experience, how does the average Muslim in the West reconcile the contradictions between Islamic doctrine and his obligation to the state as a citizen? And can Omid comment on how he reconciled those conflicts when he was a Muslim? It's a great question.
Yeah, it's an absolutely wonderful question. I will say this. That again, Islam causes a certain mindset, and that mindset actually it evolves as Islam evolves in society. Let me explain what I mean by that. Like, if you see the life of Muhammad, when Muhammad was in Mecca at the beginning of his prophetic career, he was just a warner. And warn people of idolatry and call to repentance, to worship the one true God. But as he went to Medina, what is called the Hijrah, the year 612, what he had was a large amount of followers, enough to create a parallel society. And once he grew, that parallel society grew, and it was really a parallel society, because if you read the Medina constitution, you would see that Muhammad deliberately wanted Muslims to avoid assimilating to others, but having their own laws and their own way of living. As that group grew and became more powerful and were able to conquer more, and Muhammad, he raided caravans and got wealth and so on, it became big enough to start taking over. And so Muhammad took over the entire city of Medina. He executed the entire Banu Qurayza tribe. 700 men was beheaded. The women and the children were enslaved and so on. And after that, he conquered the entire Arabian Peninsula and so on. And so we see how Muhammad evolved as Islam evolved, and that exists within Muslims as well. When they come into a society, at the beginning, they just say they're Muslims, and they don't think much about it. But as they grow, they start to create their own parallel societies, and they start to find their parallel societies, their own identities in those societies, and feel like that's where I belong, and that's where those are the laws I want to adapt my life to, and these are the people I want to be around, and I don't want to be like the Westerners. And so sermons in the mosques and so on more and more call Muslims to separate themselves and view the West with sort of hostility. And as the Muslim group grows and grows and grows, you get more and more and more parallel societies, more Sharia courtrooms and other things like that. And in the Muslim mind, the hope is that one day we're big enough to take over. That is like the goal. Now, obviously, you might say that sounds strange. However, if you think that what I've just described for you sounds strange, I will really advise you to read the literature that, or even the articles that the Muslim Brotherhood has given out. Because you see, here's the thing, that Muslims in the West, they live with a very, very, very difficult tension, with a cognitive dissonance. In one sense, the Quran describes them as being the superior people and other people being deaf, dumb, and blind. But obviously, that's not the case. The West is flourishing, the Muslim world is not. But here's the critical part. The answer can never be there's something wrong with Islam. That option is off the table. So what is the solution? Well, if you read the articles or the literature that the Muslim Brotherhood has put out, they would say that the reason Muslims are humiliated or inferior to the Western world is because they have abandoned true Islam. Just read Albani, Said Qutbi, Maududi. They all say that what is going on right now with the Muslims not being superior to the Western world is because of Allah's punishment. And they need to return to submitting to Sharia. And this actually comes from the Quran itself, because, for example, in Surah 3, verse 110 of the Quran, it says that Muslims are the best of people. Why? Because they command what is right and they forbid what is wrong. So that creates a sort of logic. It's brutal. It's very simple. Muslims think that we are not commanding what is right. We have betrayed God's law. That's why we're inferior to the Western world. So the solution is never integration or democracy, or absolutely not modernization. The solution is to return to strict Sharia, return to total obedience, return to absolute purity. We must go back to how Islam was practiced by Muhammad and his followers. And that means separating more from the Western world, becoming more hostile to the Western world, striving to make everything much more Islamic. And the entire hope there is to be again superior, again conquering the world like the Muslim armies did with Constantinople and North Africa and many other places. That's the hope. So even if you find what I just said to be strange and you think that this doesn't sound right, just read their literature and you will see that what I've described.
I think you could just look at the evolutionary track from polls done from Islamic populations in Western societies, where there is one very famous one done about, what is it now, 2016, I think it was done by Trevor Phillips in the UK, and it was titled "What Do British Muslims Think?" And I don't remember the numbers from top of my head, but if I remember correctly, the number of British Muslims who would fight for Britain if there ever was an invasion or a war was, if not in the single digits, in the very low teens. And something like only 34% of Muslims would, this was at the height of the ISIS caliphate in the Levant, only 34% of British Muslims responded that they would tell authorities that they knew of someone who had joined or was planning to join. And those numbers have since just become, the trend has not gone in a positive way ever since, if you look at any polls. So I think precisely what you were saying, Omid, is that it starts perhaps in mirroring Muhammad's life. It starts when they are a minority, when they are weak, where they are much more receptive and embracing of Western ideals and such. But once they reach that critical mass, and there is no specific quantifiable number of what that critical mass is, but once they reach that, then it becomes a bit, they embrace the doctrines that we've been discussing today. Just for the sake of time, I'll just move on. This discussion has really helped me put in context a lot of other things I've been learning along the way. The mindset. It makes me wonder how Muslim co-workers and bosses view me and others who are kafir. I'm in the US. I presume they hide their feelings and beliefs. Taqiyya. Now, if I may just get us started on that, Omid, and then you can elaborate. I think you don't need to necessarily be that skeptical, because both Omid and I know amazing Muslim people who don't necessarily view me as a kafir or Omid as a Christian as inferior to them as individuals. Uh, so if you have Muslim co-workers, I wouldn't necessarily be skeptical towards them unless they give you reason to do so. Now, taqiyya is a very contested concept in Islam. Some theologians say that it's purely a Shia Islamic concept that is not that doesn't exist within Sunni Islam, because Shia Islam was a much smaller sect and they were much more persecuted by the Sunni majority, and therefore they adopted this principle, or they created this principle of taqiyya to allow themselves to lie. Others say no, it's an Islamic thing. Omid, you're the expert here. What are your views on taqiyya in general?
Yeah, so that definitely. I mean, all scholars, whether Sunni or Shia, accept that Taqiyya was once a part of the Islamic belief, but that later on, when obviously when Muslims took over the Arabian Peninsula and became powerful, it no longer was valid. It was just temporal. That's according to Sunnis. According to Shias, it's to be valid, and you can use taqiyya, which is sort of hide your intentions or what your actual beliefs are. However, I would like to repeat what Amir just said, namely the fact that we shouldn't be overly skeptical. As I said earlier, Muslims are not a monolithic group. You have all kinds of Muslims. You have those who don't take Islam seriously, and you have those who take Islam very seriously. But what I've been trying to say is that Islam creates a certain kind of mindset, and it's not always easy to put words on that mindset. What I mean by that is it's not always easy to see it from an intellectual point of view. What do I mean? So for example, if I were to ask you, is niqab wrong? Is it wrong for women to veil the entire body except for their eyes? I mean, most people would say, yeah, there's something wrong with that, but most people wouldn't be able to describe it using words. They wouldn't be able to describe it intellectually. And when it comes to the relationship Muslims have to the West, it's something inherent. They feel like there's something wrong. This is not the way things are supposed to be. That is in the Western world, or they don't feel solidarity with Western people and so on. However, we must be careful and not make that into an intellectual conviction, like they know what's going on inside their heads. They've been just fed with Islam, and they've been worshipping Allah, and they've been simply put formed to cherish and adore certain things that is contrary to Western values. They might not know intellectually what's going on inside their heads, but that psychological formation has happened. And so, yes, there might be this very subtle and indirect, not enmity, but at least distance between the Muslim and others. The more the Muslim takes Islam seriously, the more severe that becomes.
I see that one of my heroes and someone I adore wants to make a comment on this. So, Karen, I'm going to bring you to stage.
Yeah.
I love you.
Hi.
So
You're
good
my
to see,
hero.
so good
Yeah,
to
I
see.
I love your writings. I'm always happy to read your
Likewise.
writings. Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm enjoying this discussion, and I come from very a conservative fundamentalist Christian background. So my father was one of the foremost Christian authors until Dave Hunt, until he passed away in 2013. So in some ways I understand this concept very well of this fundamentalism. I could go on and on with this, so I'll try and stay short. But I was raised that every morning you get up and you put on the full armor of God and you go out, and because the devil is going to be there everywhere around you, and you are in the world but you are not of the world. So it's kind of a similar thing, but the difference is that it comes from a place of love. I love you. I will do all that. I would give my life. That I was raised like this. Wonderful, wonderful, incredible parents. You give your life for your enemy. You sacrifice yourself, and you show by how you live what you believe. That's how I was raised. So I contrasted that. Then I lived for 3 years. I went to Luxor, Egypt, to find the
Mm.
truth of Islam. Like, when I want to find out something, I go all the way. And
Yes.
what was interesting to me was there's this same fundamentalist attitude but the standard is so high. You can never achieve that standard. This is the problem. No matter what you do, and I was never given an answer of how you achieve that. So what happens is, and I saw this also because my father spoke out against prosperity preachers. He was on the he loved Israel, spoke out about against Islam, spoke out against, just an amazing like voice. So you cannot achieve this. So what happens is you become a hypocrite. Everybody in Luxor was a hypocrite. They would put on this demeanor, but behind it was they would do things, and then Ramadan would come, and then you would make up for all of your sins during Ramadan. And the other thing was too, and I'm writing this in a book. I'm calling it actually The Seduction of Islam,
No.
because that's what happens. Foreign women would come there and be seduced by these men, and fall under their spell. And what they did was they really, and people would say to me, well, that's no different than any other country, right? They do
Mm.
that in every country. I said, no, it is very different, because what they have is a fundamental religious belief that they have the right to do that to you, because you are a kafir, you are beneath them. So there was a saying in Luxor that if a woman is lucky enough to get out, she gets out with the skin on her back and nothing else,
Yeah.
because everything goes. So that's all I wanted to say. I related to what you're talking about with this concept of, the standard that no one can ever live up to. And this is a fundamental problem that creates a lot of frustration. And also, for moderate Muslims, they will very rarely criticize Islam at all,
Mm.
because of the fear of what, there's no sense of humor in Islam. So that fear of what might happen to them if they do. And people will keep these things to themselves. They keep, and this is not a healthy way to live, basically. So that's what I wanted to contribute.
Oh, really, really appreciate that input. And then I saw that Omid was smiling when you said that your father was Dave Hunt. Omid, just curious, from a coincidental perspective, how familiar are you with? Because I know you are a theologian yourself, and you know practically everyone.
I obviously know who Dave Hunt, who he was, and his radio program and his books and so on. Very, very famous American pastor, and pleasure to meet his daughter.
Yeah,
It's
really.
more than I could ever live up to, but I do my best.
No, it's so lovely to see you, and to have hear your voice. So it's a pleasure, really, Karen, and thank you for all your
Thank you.
support. And I love your writing too. We only have 9 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we get through as many questions as possible. Ruth's is okay. Please just ask my second question. Ignore the first. Okay. Muslims in the US are starting to outnumber some other groups like Italians. They're also running and winning elected office like Mamdani, but there are more. I'm nervous about this. What would you expect to happen when they have the numbers to win executive power or majorities in one of the houses of the Congress? Also, is it possible that Muslims will never leave Israel alone and stop trying to erase and replace Jews in our own stories? I'm okay with taking the second part of that, Omid, because I know that's more, well, not my area of expertise, but an area that I'm probably more interested in than you are. But happy for you to take the first part.
Well, I got to be honest. When it comes to politics, I don't know much about politics. I'm a theologian. I know Islam and how Islam impacts the mind. And when it comes to Mamdani and so on, what I've heard from Muslims themselves is that actually they don't really praise him. They view him as a very liberal Muslim. But I don't know. I don't know. That's what I've
Yeah,
heard.
I mean, obviously, living in the UK, I have a prime example from London, where I used to live for 15 years, where the mayor there is Sadiq Khan, and he's claims to be a devout Muslim, and he prays 5 times a day. But he's also the biggest proponent of pride, for example. And Mamdani strikes me as very much a similar character, where he's also a socialist and a Marxist, which
Mm.
is at odds just as much as liberal or capitalism is with Islam. So is Marxism. I mean, Marxism is definedly atheistic. So I wouldn't.
Wouldn't you think for a second? I'm sorry for interrupting
No,
you there,
no.
but wouldn't you think like my enemy's my enemy's enemy is my friend? Because if you think about it this way, I mean, what are the greatest like challenges towards the Western world and the Western values? It's actually either it's socialism, is Islam. It's like those are
Yeah,
our
yeah, yeah.
enemies, sort of.
The
And
Red
don't you
Green
think?
Alliance. Yeah.
Yeah, precisely. And don't you think that somewhere it is also true that um, the Western ideology actually, even though it's well intentioned, it actually feeds this problem with Islamism, in the sense that Islamism thrives when when the West is self-critical, and thereby defends the Muslim minority, which leftists do, because the leftists see Muslims as victims that needs to be supported rather than and engaged, if that makes sense. So somehow Muslims voting for the left and supporting the left, that makes sense because the left really gives them room and supports them and so on. And the West is also anti. I'm sorry, the
Yeah, yeah,
left. The
yeah. No,
left is
you're
very
absolutely
anti-West.
right. You're absolutely right. Definitely, and we've seen that countless times. I mean, we're both from Iran, so we know that the 1979 revolution happened precisely because the Red Green Alliance, the leftists, the communists, the Marxists, the socialists joined forces with the Islamists. And then, well, I hate to use the word Islamists. I don't believe in that, but with the Muslims, and that brought down the sort of somewhat westernized society of Iran or Persia. And once the Muslims were in power, then they no longer needed the leftists, and they slaughtered them en masse. Um, I know what I think you're also, Ruth, referring a bit to Dearborn, Michigan, and those places where we are seeing more sort of openly uh, devout or fanatical Muslims taking power. Now, I I don't I I have very little hope for society at large, but I I find it very hard to believe that Islam can ever gain a foothold in the US in particular. The US is unlike any other nation on earth, um, where, first of all, because of its size and because of its massive diversity, the fact that you can have a unified uh, power like Islam, which is alien to the US, gaining such a foothold where it can constitute a threat. I'm just making predictions here, but I don't see that likely. Whereas if you see it in Sweden or in the UK, it's much more linear. If you want, for the second part of your question, no, I do not believe that there will ever come a day where Muslims will accept Israel. Now, it does happen. We've seen it with the Abraham Accords, and there's a potential that Saudi Arabia now joins that, and I've heard even talks about Jordan and such. So yes, at certain levels it does happen. However, just like Omid has been saying throughout this conversation, at some point it has to hit a brick wall, because what you're asking at one point is that the devout Muslim rejects Islam to accept Israel. That tension is insurmountable at some point. And where you have Muslims who are as devout as they fall into the Muslim Brotherhood category and all the offshoots from the Muslim Brotherhood, that type of Muslim is really the most not just devout, but the most fundamental. And for that type of Muslim to reject such a core element of his worldview, to be able to acknowledge and accept that Jews have a homeland within their territory, is an affront to everything they believe. So I don't ever see that happening. And I think the best we can hope for is that more and more countries join the Abraham Accords and reconcile their relationships with Israel, and those that are left that refuse to do so become such a minority that they, whatever they do has minimal impact. Sorry, very, very long answer to that. Oddly, the left and the right joining forces with Islam is the one thing they have in common: hatred of Jews and the destruction of Israel. Who would have thought Tucker Carlson defended Mamdani? The worry in the US is the rise of the far right. Yeah, I think that's just, we're living in a very strange times where you have utter cretins like Carlson or Candace Owens and such, talking, first of all, about things they know nothing about. I mean, I've heard Tucker Carlson talk about, the greatness of Sharia, and talk about how the Taliban doesn't have, has a fantastic drug rehabilitation program. That's like saying there is no crime in North Korea. Yes, that's probably true, but there is a reason behind that. So yeah, I personally can't take them seriously. Omid, I know we're up against time now, but I want to make sure that we have any, if there are any other questions, we just take one or two more before we let you go. Please feel free to put in the letter Q in the chat if you have a question and want to come up on stage. Otherwise, I'll try to wrap this up by asking Omid, is there anything that you feel that we left out that you want to bring out? Is there anything that you feel we should have elaborated more on, or we didn't touch on that we should have touched on?
I think that what we need to do in West is also realize that many of our values, much of our values, they actually, when it comes to human dignity and how we interact with each other, it comes from actually a Christian worldview. And even if you don't adhere to that worldview necessarily, you should appreciate it for what it has given us. And because the Christian worldview is very, very, very different from the Muslim worldview. Because as I earlier said, in the Muslim worldview, in Islam, the center is law. Life is about submitting to Allah in all his detailed commands about how you pray, how you dress, how you marry, how you judge, how you rule, everything. But in Christianity, it's about a person, namely the person of Jesus Christ, who touched lepers, lifted the shame, washed feet, and died for his enemies. And once you have a society where the role model becomes Jesus Christ, someone who sought the impure, ate with sinners, embraced prostitutes and outcasts, and actually reserved his harshest rebukes for the religious exclusive people, and he even suffered and died for his enemy, for sinners, thereby embracing shame. Once you have the cross at the center, then it becomes impossible to uphold a honor and shame system. It becomes impossible to have this xenophobia where you divide people into the pure and the non-pure, and it becomes impossible to devalue people. Rather, everybody's so valuable because God loves them and Jesus died for them, and they're made in the image of God, and so on. And also, Jesus Christ obviously wasn't a socio-political person. I mean, he very clearly distinguished between state and religion. He said, "My kingdom is not of this world. Give to Caesar what is Caesar. Give to God's what is God," and so on. And so that's why it is possible to have a nation that is built on Christian values, that is still secular, and Christians can embrace that as well. And we need to realize that. We need to realize that much of our values comes from this, from Christianity, and even if we're secular, and not just acknowledge that, but to cherish that and fight for that, and to realize all the goodness it has given us, and realize Islam is coming with something utterly different, and we see the results in the Muslim world. We should fight against that because we have something better.
Yeah, I often talk about the machinery that produces a society. And you look at the fruits of a labor or fruits of a machinery, the products that a machinery produces. Just look empirically. Look at the Islamic world. What is the machinery there? There it is Islam. It's the one unifying factor of countries that may have totally different histories. I mean, if you look at the history of Egypt versus the history of what we today call Saudi Arabia, they're totally different. However, once Islam became the unifying machinery of those societies, it started producing the same results. And that's the result we see today. Conversely, look at the West. What is the machinery that has produced the West? What gave rise to the Enlightenment? What gave rise to Sartre and to Shakespeare and to Isaac Newton, etc.? What was that machinery behind it that produced those things? I would say it was Judeo-Christian uh, values, or the ontological foundation of Judeo-Christian. And I say this as an atheist. I'm not saying this as a believer or anything, but I think it takes a lot of rejection of empirical facts to deny that. One thing that we haven't touched on, and Omid, I don't know how you're doing with time, if we can go for another 5 minutes and I can elaborate on something that I wanted to talk about. Is that okay?
Yeah, we can go on for a few more minutes.
Yeah, just 5 more minutes is one thing I've so my enterprise, my personal enterprise, and my readers who've been so kind to join today's event, I noticed that I didn't know this beforehand, but StreamYard only allows 15 people. So I dread to think how many people tried to get in but didn't. But my readers will know this, that my enterprise is to fight Islam. It's not Islamism. It's not jihadism. I don't believe in those things. I think those are just our way of cowering to Islam. Now, why do I say that? 2 reasons. One is that we don't make this acquiescence to any other ideology. We don't make it for Nazism. We don't make it for communism. We don't make it for any other ideology. But as soon as it comes to Islam, because we're scared to offend the so-called peaceful majority, we say, well, they're just Muslims. They're not our enemies. Our enemies are the so-called Islamists or jihadists. I think that's a distinction without a difference, because, and this is reason number 2, is they themselves call themselves Muslims. They don't call themselves Islamists. If you saw a Nazi, or if you saw a member of Pol Pot's murdering squads. They wouldn't define themselves as communists. They would just say, I'm a communist or I'm a Nazi. Same thing when we hear someone say, I am doing this because of Islam. It is not incumbent on us to say, no, 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 you're wrong. You're an Islamist, because Muslims are Muslims. And until we acknowledge that our fight is against Islam, what Omid and I have been talking about for the last 90 minutes or so, until we acknowledge that, we're still going to be in this loop of, well, no, we're just fighting the Islamists and the jihadists. We're never going to get anywhere. That's, I suppose there's no question at the end of that, but I suppose, Omid, if you have any thoughts on that, I'd love to hear it. Otherwise, we can just wrap up.
So let me just quickly say that here in Sweden, we've had many Muslim schools. Today, we only have one single Muslim school in the town of Växjö. Everyone else is closed. Like, we're talking about at least maybe 20 Muslim schools.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And not only that, I mean, a lot of mosques and even Muslim organizations, like, for example, we had a very large Muslim organization called Ibn Rushd that was and closed after getting millions and millions of tax crowns. Sorry. Never mind. The reason is this, that what all these schools and organizations and mosques have been doing is that they've been extremely influenced by what Amir just referred to as Islamism or the Muslim Brotherhood and such organization. And why? Because this is why the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist groups are so powerful. When they speak to you, they quote the Islamic scripture. They say exactly what the Quran says and exactly what Muhammad said. They start off by saying that Surah 33, verse 21, Muhammad is the pattern of conduct. All Muslims must try to be like Muhammad. Surah 4, verse 65, they must obey Muhammad and do what Muhammad said. Surah 4, verse 80, the same thing, and so on and so on. And they show you in the Islamic scripture itself what kind of a Muslim Muhammad was. Was he a moderate Muslim? Was he a liberal Muslim? Let's just take one single example. Let's take one extreme example. How did Muhammad treat female captives? Surah 4, verse 24 of the Quran says that you are allowed to have sex with female captives despite their husbands being alive. You can read about the context behind that in, for example, Sunan Abu Dawud and Book 2, Hadith 2150. And so Muhammad allowed his Muslim followers to have sex with female captives and rape them despite their husbands being alive. He conquered the entire Arabian Peninsula. His followers after him conquered so much more, the entire North Africa and Iraq and many other places, so on, so on, through violence. And they established Sharia law. And if you were the people of the book, you had to be subjugated and be second-class citizens who paid the jizya and so on. I mean, there's no getting around this. What I mean by that is that, of course, there are people that identify themselves as Muslims and are very peaceful, no doubt about it at all, and are very good people, good citizens. But when you take Islam seriously and become, objectively speaking, someone who wants to be like Muhammad, someone who wants to take the Quran seriously and the Islamic theology seriously, it is inevitable for you to be hostile towards the West and find the West as your enemy, and the conflict just going to increase.
Exactly. I often challenge anyone who says, no, there is Islamism and there is jihadism. Say, oh yeah, what book do they worship that the Muslims don't? And it's rarely that you get an answer. I hope, everyone, that this was interesting, that you found something worth from this time that you've been so generous to give us. And Omid, you've been incredibly generous with your time as well. I know how busy you are, so I really appreciate it. Sorry, Karen has something to say. I do apologize. Let me just bring you to stage, Karen. There we go.
Sorry, one little thing. My dad used to always say, Islam is an extreme religion. That's what it is. There's no moderation in Islam, so you can you can have moderate people, but they're not being honest. They're
Mm.
not following their religion honestly. And this is just one thing I say to people that argue with me. I say, so if Jesus was standing in front of you and Muhammad was standing in front of you, who would you want to babysit your 6-year-old daughter? I rest my case.
Well,
And then, there is no answer ever.
that's that's a
That was brutal.
we're laughing,
That
but
was
it's
brutal.
that is brutal. Yeah. Well, thank you all so much once more. I'm so
Thank you very
grateful,
much.
everyone. And Omid, thank you for your generous time as well. We'll hopefully do this again. And until then, stay safe. Lots of love.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, all.